Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Dr. Christian Parenti, a professor of economics at John Jay College, CUNY. He is the author of 5 books that deal with themes of state repression, social control, and political economy. I welcome Christian Parenti to Savage Minds. I was overwhelmed by your article when I read it the other day, hence I wrote you. Your article in the Gray Zone, How the Organized Left Got COVID Wrong, Learned to Love Lockdowns, and Lost Its Mind, an autopsy. You point out in this article how the left has been stuck in March 2020, writing, its members have applauded the new biosecurity repression and calumniated as liars, grifters, and fascists any and all who dissented. Well, we saw this not only in the US, but around the planet, most especially in Italy, Australia, New Zealand. And I was not surprised by what you uncovered, given the plethora of identity politics that has taken over the left, where feeling has come to trump material reality and, dare I say, science. So we saw our society overwhelmed in March 2020. Here, February 23rd, people were frightened. I was one of them. I was like, oh my God, this is, horrible. But within 2 weeks, we knew who was at risk. We knew what the contagion meant in a very basic way still. And this seemed to have been the pause button that everyone conveniently touched. And we've remained stuck in this. What do you think brought this on in terms of a political framework where the left is ostensibly supposed to be looking out for the working class? I had to tune into Fox News to hear anyone talk about the working class.
Yeah, it's true. I think this is a very American-centric answer, but I think it's important because of the role of America dominates public health globally. The WHO, 2 biggest funders are the American government and the Gates Foundation, right? So it's like America really sets the agenda for public health globally. And I think what happened was the election season of trying to get Trump out of office, and Trump derangement syndrome is what kind of got this whole thing spinning. There, as I explained in the article, since the 1976 swine flu outbreak, which basically, was a non-event. And the U.S., it begins, there's a couple soldiers at Fort Detrick in the U.S. get sick with something. One soldier dies. It's not clear what it is. And the pandemic industrial complex, if you will, that is to say, the symbiotic relationship between the regulators and big pharma, so the CDC and NIH and big pharma, kind of kick into high gear. They crank out this vaccine, and 20% of the country is vaccinated, including President Ford, before it is realized by researchers, academic researchers, the press, and the political class in both parties, that wait a minute, this swine flu is actually quite mild. It's not clear that anyone even died of it, and that the vaccine was creating Guillain-Barré syndrome. A sometimes permanent, sometimes temporary paralyzing syndrome, autoimmune disease. Several hundred people died. 4,000 people claimed that they were injured and sued the federal government, and the vaccine campaign was suspended. From that point on, you see this pattern of this symbiotic alliance between industry and the regulators, with each new virus attempting to gin up hysteria and panic. And this was, until this moment, always thwarted to some extent by the critical capacities of the political class and the journalistic class. And people would eventually say, well, wait a minute. I mean, it doesn't seem like, Zika is as bad as you say, or whatever. I mean, it even happened with HIV, right? I mean, they were, Anthony Fauci, whose outfit, the NIAID, is a subset of NIH, he really rises to prominence with HIV, and they are pushing vaccines, right? I mean, there's still no HIV vaccine, right? And they're like maniacally focused on vaccines around HIV. And interestingly, it's not until, I think it's 87, that Pelosi actually calls out Fauci and when I say they're maniacally fixated on vaccines, I mean they refuse to deal with what the the community, doctors and people suffering from AIDS and people with HIV are experimenting with alternative treatments, off-label use of various drugs. And the government is refusing to study any of this, right? And that means it's impossible. And if they don't study it, then they don't, give it any credibility. And if they don't give it any credibility, then insurance doesn't cover it, et cetera, right? And so Pelosi actually calls out Fauci at a hearing. She says, if you had AIDS, would you do these various things, that the alternative, the research community was experimenting with? And he says, foolishly, not realizing what he's saying, yeah, if I had AIDS, I would, and pneumonia, I would nebulize with this or that. I forget what the actual drugs were that they were working with. And they realize it, and he realizes, like, well, I made a mistake, and people turn on him. And so then Fauci does an about face, and he starts working for 2 years with the community forces that are trying to develop treatments, right? As opposed to just what he'd done previously, which was just say, never mind treatment, we got to wait for the vaccine, right? So even with HIV, you've got this check on the kind of vaccine fixation, right? But what happened this time around, and it happens again and again with each one of these vaccines, is just like ginning up this hysteria. And this time around, it was caught up in the tornado of Trump derangement syndrome and the election. And so in March 2020, you have March 10th, the Democratic mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, is saying, look, if you're under 50, you got and healthy, you got nothing to worry about from this. Like, you might not even have symptoms, or if you do, it'll be like the flu. 5 days later, he's closing all the public schools. And what happens in that month is that the virus becomes clearly politicized, and both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, decide to face off on this. The Democrats think, okay, this time we've really got Trump, and the Republicans think, okay, we are going to own the reopening, and the Democrats are going to own the lockdowns, and the lockdowns are going to be very unpopular, right? And so the Republicans sort of throw down the gauntlet, as it were, by Trump in late March saying, we want to open the economy by April. And then simultaneous with that, there are at least 32 protests in state capitals, which are organic in that it's like real people, mostly kind of small business owners, feeling crushed by the lockdowns. But there's also right-wing financial support coming from the DeVos Families Foundation and other kind of donor network types. And some of these protests are, people carrying guns, carrying Confederate flags. It's this like hard right element marching on state capitals. In Michigan, they're like, particularly harsh in how they attack the governor, Gretchen Whitmer. And so that just completely terrifies and whips up the Democratic Party ecosystem and base. And at that point, it's just off to the races. There's no room whatsoever for the left, broadly defined, led by the Democratic Party, even when the elements of the left that criticize the Democratic Party and don't think that they're part of its ecosystem, they're nonetheless dragged along by it. So at that point, there's no room for any kind of rethink, and we cannot accept new facts as they come in. And simultaneous with these spectacular and scary looking protests at state capitals, what's going on and is not being covered in the news is that New York City has opened 5 field hospitals and badgered the Trump administration to send a naval hospital ship with 1,100 beds. And none of these are used. And so they're all quietly closed. And, and there's no public rethink about, okay, well, wait a minute, this is a serious disease, but how serious is it really, the second coming of the Spanish flu or not? And there couldn't have that moment of rethink because of Trump derangement syndrome, the fear that this guy was an American Mussolini. And in reality, I mean, Trump certainly seems to have kind of, fascistic tendencies, but Trump is also profoundly incompetent, and that's actually a crucial part of this. Trump couldn't control his his own COVID task force. Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx are out there spinning every day, whipping up hysteria. And according to Scott Atlas, who is a medical doctor who leans to the right, who's brought on to the Trump COVID task force and then writes a book about his experience. And he's obviously really loves Trump. And so he's very, muted in his criticism, but you can still tell, that basically like the situation is that Trump doesn't like this task force, but he's too incompetent to do anything about it. If Jared Kushner doesn't execute it for him, it doesn't happen. Jared Kushner seems to get really spooked by the press coverage, and they kind of freeze and they allow this task force to carry on with its messaging. Trump does his own alternative messaging, but never moves to shut down the task force. And the lockdowns are done by state governors, right? And so the contradiction, of course, is that there are Republican governors who also pursue pretty aggressive lockdowns. But by mid-April, the pandemic in the United States is totally politicized. And, this kind of total lack of reason, total lack of reconsideration is pushed down through the international public health bureaucracy. And it's not that the rest of the world then just like does what the American dominated public health infrastructure tells them to. It's that also like in every power center in the world, from the Italian government to street gangs in Latin America, every hierarchy, every power center uses this emergency, this crisis, to just grab power and do more of what it was already doing. And so then we're off to the races, and everybody is, everybody with power is abusing it in the name of public safety.
Yes, we saw this immediately in Italy, where we were barred very early on from leaving our homes. The lockdown started on 23 February, and 10 days later, we could not leave our homes. And to leave our homes only for shopping, medicine, hospital, basically, we had to print out a form which changed almost on a daily basis. So we were constantly having to Google what the latest form was, print it out, just to go to the shop. And we
That's
had
terrible.
queues outside of it was awful. I was in fear because I was a new immigrant to Italy. And it was daunting to think that you could be stopped after reading the expose by the CNN journalist who was almost arrested because she was sitting next to her husband in the car. They got a summons because of this. And I thought, well, this is insane. So you can sleep together in the same bed, but you can't drive in the same car. And she was right outside of Milan when this happened. And the draconian measures taken here were all in some kind of perverse homage to what China was doing. And of course, that left me with bells ringing, thinking, since when has any Western government taken its cues from China in terms of mass population control?
Yeah, that's a good point. The imitation of China, and the kind of there is a sort of growing anxiety about liberal democracy and neoliberal capitalism in the West, right? I mean, even the proponents of it, of both of those, can feel the failures, right? The stagnant quality of capitalism, due to the increasing inequality and deindustrialized, financialized nature of it. And I mean, there's a general anxiety about climate change and about just environmental crisis in general, and also the sort of ongoing political breakdown in the global South. It's impossible to prove this, but it feels to me that there's a general anxiety growing in the West, and that even as people are critical of China and others, heavy-handed developmentalist states in East Asia, there's also a kind of envy and a projection that, well, maybe they know how to deal with this situation. Like maybe their version of things is going to work, because obviously China is going through a remarkable economic transformation, right? I mean, you can criticize China for its total lack of concern for civil liberties, but they have raised the standard of living for hundreds of millions of people. Basically, the vast majority of progress that has been made against poverty at a global scale is due to China and its tremendous economic development over the last 40 years. So there is a kind of weird envy in it, and an imitation of China. You're right. I think that in addition to my American focused explanation, that needs to be added to it.
Well, there's also this aspect of the left clinging on to lockdown so ferociously and early on. And this rather struck me because I was thinking, wait, all you guys are doing Deliveroo to your home, working from your laptops, but no one is thinking about all the people who are barred access to earning a living, whose governments will not be supplanting their lost income with any kind of bursaries or grants.
Yeah, that you're referring to the global South primarily. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in the U.S., the one good thing that happened was that there was increased unemployment, and there were stimulus checks, stimmy checks as we call them here, and actually personal savings went up. I mean, the American working class is so broke and so indebted that just giving people a break from an eviction moratorium, a break from student loans, and kicking a little cash down to people, a couple $1,000s a head now and then, and we saw personal savings go up 8%, and actually economic well-being increased. So that to some extent felt like a victory for the left. But also I think that it's the politics of the defeated camp. It's an extension of the kind of politics of therapeutic politics of emotional tyranny and identity politics and wokeness, right? That this is the left hasn't had many victories against capital or the state in a long time. And so it has, particularly in the age of social media, turned on itself. And its victories, its little fake victories instead are running this or that professor or journalist out of their job for misspeaking, right? And that's what's going on. It's like a defeated camp after a siege turning on itself.
It's not surprising the way identity politics has fed into the reaction to COVID, or the fact that left-wing publications were drumming up the fear. You note in your article in the Grey Zone how Jacobin writer Branko Marcetic called for the unvaccinated to be barred from public transportation, while this is exactly what has come to pass in many countries, like Italy, where until the 1st of April, you couldn't take any public transport without certain types of passes. The green pass, the super green pass, then there was a super green pass. I've lost count of how many times they want to accentuate green pass here. And of course, it's green pass. And they love saying it in English. But the other side of this is that you have a whole class of people without cars, people who are poor who cannot access basic necessities. And nobody, even on the left here in Italy, was talking about this, aside from you had Agamben who was speaking out. You had a lot of academic voices speaking against this, but they were tarnished as being closet right-wingers. It was bizarre to witness. At the same time, you have Pelosi. I don't know if you caught that clip of her standing in front of her $10,000 refrigerator, eating what looked like, if I Googled it, it looked like to be an $8 frozen yogurt. And she's telling people to have fun during lockdown. And I'm thinking, these people are entirely detached from the reality of most working class people.
Absolutely. Nancy Pelosi is one of the richest members of Congress. At one point, she was worth $120 million. Somehow $50 million of that disappeared. I don't know if she, gave it to the next generation. She probably made she probably did what rich people do, which is you make a no interest loan to the next generation, who will then inherit both ends of the loan when you pass away. So she probably did that. Who knows? But yeah, I mean, she's part of the 1%. I don't know if we should include her in the left, but yeah. But the left, what's more disturbing in a way, I mean, because Pelosi's going to be Pelosi. But yeah, the fact that some unions, like my union at CUNY, the PSC, the Professional Staff Congress, the administration had settled into a vaccinate or test regime, is fine. You just have to do regular testing if you're not going to get vaccinated. And the union, because of the hysterical fear of many of the members, is now pushing the administration to force everyone to get vaccinated. In New York City, 3,000, almost 3,000 public workers have been fired for refusing to submit to vaccination. The teachers in the public schools have, officially they have religious and medical exemptions, but there have been no religious exemptions offered, and maybe a few medical exemptions. So, you know, unions have actually, some unions have been worse than employers on this. To be fair, most unions haven't done that, but certain professional unions have have done that. The teachers here in Massachusetts were as late as the last day of December of last year demanding that the schools remained closed, right? And I mean, there's no basis in science for this. I mean, kids basically don't get COVID. The juvenile deaths from COVID were at one point around 7,000. All these people had serious comorbidities. Well, that number's actually even been cut in half, right? So nationally, we're talking about 3,000 people below the age of 19 have died of COVID, right? Or with COVID, right? And yet the teachers union here in Massachusetts was demanding that schools be closed, which is very short-sighted because politics are involved here and parents don't like this. And, unions should be concerned not only about the narrow fears of their members, but also about the broader political horizon and the respectability and the brand of the union and the broader struggle beyond the workplace for a set of policies that defend the interests of the working class. And to just pretend that this is reasonable to hold parents and students hostage because you've got some some percentage of the members who are unhealthy, it's very bad politics. And then now that has shown up as crushing electoral defeats for Democrats. Virginia, most famously, where there was a Democratic favorite, Terry McAuliffe, who was favored, and he got crushed by the guy who came out of nowhere, Youngkin. And the press tried to cast all this as being about white racism and fear of critical race theory in the schools, but there's actually very little proof of that. And there's much more proof that parents were furious at the really extreme lockdowns Virginia was suffering. And it had some of the worst school lockdowns in the country. They even closed playgrounds, and people were arrested for cutting police tape and going into these empty playgrounds, right? And the polling afterwards showed that the almost 20-point swing from Democrats over to Republicans in Virginia was led by women, that education was one of the top concerns, and that in terms of education, one of the top concerns was learning loss and the disaster that was online learning and all of that.
The online learning seemed to be this magical panacea that countries across the West were saying works. Although you speak to teachers, parents, even kids, it was a disaster in Italy. People were having
Yeah.
nervous breakdowns. How are you supposed to, as a parent at home, take care of the needs of a child in nursery school, another child in elementary school, and have time to sleep? This is
Yeah.
something no one really thought through. And no one thought through the fact that even those of us working from our computers at home have to work from our computers at home to earn a living. We can't suddenly not work or magically, in an Einsteinian way, figure out that time space continuum and
Yeah.
poof, there's another day in every day. No one
Yeah.
thought this through. And of course, I've written a lot about how women were the ones who were shouldered with the burden of a lot of what was going on. You had doctors here in Italy, mothers, who could not go to the hospital because they had to make a choice between a salary or their child's education. No one thought this through. And as much
Yeah.
as we would read the babysitter bonus here, what a nightmare. In order to be able to pay a babysitter bonus, you ought to be earning what is much higher than the average national wage in Italy. There is no way that someone can pay someone €1,200 a month and be a working class person, because the salaries wouldn't permit that. So there was a lot of blind spots in figuring out
Yeah,
how to get people to stay at home.
totally terrible. I mean, in Baltimore, something like 20% of school kids never logged on. I mean, like tens of thousands of kids in this country just disappeared for, a year and a half, 2 years. And a lot of people don't have internet, right? They're trying to do this on their phones. It's totally insane. And the fact that the left couldn't deal with this. I mean, even as recently as like 2 months ago, I saw a pundit who will remain unnamed because I actually really respect their politics generally, saying, well, the problem with school lockdowns, if we just had childcare for all. And it's just like, that is so ridiculous, right? As if, first of all, that all school is childcare. And then it's like, okay, let's say we did have that. If we had childcare for all, like, and maybe we could offer instruction at these childcare centers. And gee, maybe we should call these childcare centers public schools. It's like, what are you talking about? You know, it's just the mindlessness. And this is part of the whole situation that I don't really get, which is the passion, the alacrity, the intensity that so many on the left have had in their embrace of this deeply antisocial um, lockdowns. I mean, I can explain, like Pfizer made 22 billion profit, profits equal to the entire size of the Cambodian economy. So we know why Pfizer and all those who are invested in Pfizer have done what they've done. But why these like young writers in Jacobin? Why what is all this? I don't quite get it. And I have to resort to some psychoanalysis or something to some extent, which is that there's some sort of libidinal pleasure, right? Just a sadomasochistic pleasure in submitting to the rules, submitting to regulation, and also simultaneously having justification to lash out and condemn and cancel and isolate others, right? I don't tend to like to go in for psychological explanations, but that seems to be part of what's going on here.
Certainly, there are those who believe that this is a control of the masses. And it's hard to argue against that when we
It
see that
certainly is,
now,
yeah.
2 years later, you have people afraid to leave their houses. I've spoken with people in grocery store lines here who tell me about their brother, their sister, their parents who don't want to leave the house. The governments have done lockdown so well that they don't know how to get out of lockdown, which of course will have knock on effects to the economy,
Right.
but no one is talking about the knock on effects to mental health. And I tell you, Christian, I pitched pieces throughout 2020 about the effects of lockdown on mental health to leftist publications, and one after another, I got the emails all the same. We can't run such a piece because it will look like we're against lockdown. What in the
Really, they
hell
said
is
that.
this? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And why is it that
Good
any
for you for
editor,
doing that.
well, any editor on the left who's reading my pitch should consider even a draft and then get back to me? But they didn't even want the pitch. And this is what bothered me. It wasn't like I handed them a shoddy article or something. They
Yeah.
didn't want to even consider that this would affect mental health, which, as we know today, is greatly affected.
Yeah. There's also been a real collapse in critical thinking. I mean, people clearly are not following the details, right? And they basically skim headlines, they listen to NPR, and they refuse to engage with new facts as they emerge. And that, I think, is pretty sad and pretty pathetic. And I blame social media for a lot of this.
Me too.
And I'm not on social media, and I'm not on social media because I've got a stack of books that remain unread. I don't want to read people's hot takes. But I've noticed, and every night I'll look at social media, and I mean, very frequently I'm just embarrassed by what I see intelligent people who I know in real life, the kinds of things they tweet, and they degrade themselves with these like stupid little fortune cookie sized comments. But I mean, I've noticed that social media definitely inculcates groupthink, and it also inculcates and rewards bullshitting. You know, jumping to conclusions, pretending that you've read something. There's a lot of that.
Oh, everyone was an immunologist on Twitter. Everyone had something to say about what scientists who've studied the field have spoken out against. So everyone was like, well, that's not true. Really? Mrs. Epidemiologist?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not just to push back a little bit on that. I'm not against that. I don't think. I think another problem in all this has been this like veneration of experts. Expert knowledge, as Winston Churchill said, is very, um, very narrow knowledge. Experts have like a lot of expertise on one thing, but it doesn't mean they're right about everything. And so I think there is a place for people to try and understand science, try and understand policy, for lay people to engage with what experts are saying. And lay people have to have humility in doing that. But the idea that it's just like, oh, you shouldn't engage, you're not an immunologist, so shut up. It's like, well, wait a minute. Many of these immunologists are way out of their lane. They have like one little specialization, and then they just start rambling on about things that they're no more qualified than anyone else to talk about. The effects of lockdowns, what this is going to do to the economy, how technology affects kids' brains. It's like, you know,
Right. Well, I was referring more so to the way that people would use places like Twitter or Facebook to come up with their overnight immunological training to try to counteract someone who is speaking against lockdown. For instance, the
mhm,
Great Barrington Declaration. People would say immediately on Twitter, oh, that's bullshit. They don't know what they're talking about. But they didn't take any time to do anything other than read a few headlines or read a few other tweets of people they follow. So it
yeah,
becomes this mass group think where
yep,
no one is free to really independently critique.
yep,
Social media gives this pastiche, this panorama of everyone's an individual, but in the end, it's the opposite.
yep,
Everyone was banding around, blocking anyone that didn't agree with them, calling out. And we saw this earlier on than COVID. We saw this around the wars over gender identity. And not surprisingly, Jacobin had run a hit piece on me many years ago after I published my first piece in 2013 on the debate between feminists and transgender activists in the UK. And I took many months to write the piece. And then Jacobin ran the piece saying, basically, I'm going to quote it, if Julian Vigo questioned the existence of straight privilege instead of the existence of cisgender privilege, she would instantly be shouted down by a chorus of gay affirmative voices. Now, the point of my piece was, in fact, questioning what in the hell is cisgender privilege when you're talking to women, right? And this is what the
mhm,
feminists have been saying for well over a decade. There is no cis identity. But magically, identity is spun by these words that then we see fomented on social media, such that if you dare say the recent Leah Thomas scandal, if you say Leah Thomas is male, you can lose your Twitter account very
yeah.
easily. You are
It's
in the
it's
dozens
it's
of women
amazing.
kicked off of social media. Megan Murphy from
Yep.
Canada Feminist Current was kicked off. She took Twitter to court, tried to get her account back, arguing, her lawyer argued that Twitter is the social public square. Of course, it's privately owned. It lost. But there are questions to be raised in as much as free speech and being able to say, hey, lockdowns weren't a great idea, and
Hmm.
not being able to be booted off of social media for saying that. And we see
Yeah.
this around Russia and Ukraine as well. We see that anyone who says something that is considered over the top is kicked off. But who decides what that over the top is?
Yeah. A bunch of, billionaires, a bunch of American oligarchs who have, masked capitalist exploitation in this fog of woke identity politics. It's divide et impera, right? Divide and rule. It's all laid out in Federalist 10, that James Madison wrote, where he says, look, you can never overcome faction. Society is never going to be uniformly supportive of the social structure of government. So the way to rule is to lean into faction and make sure that there's lots of it. And he says it very explicitly. He says, the most dangerous and common form of faction is that based on what we would say class, right? And he says property, right? Those who own property and those who don't. And so it's a kind of jujitsu argument. So you got to lean into faction and make sure there's a proliferation of faction so that it can become kind of politically invigorating, because what you don't want is a majority of people to come together around the question of property, right? I mean, that's why Federalist 10 is one of the great political documents of the modern era. And that's what identity politics is about. It's not that identities don't matter. It's not that there aren't legitimate issues involved in here, but it's that these, these identity struggles are used to crowd out questions around class, questions around property and exploitation, and how things are produced, what is produced, and who gets what.
Well, you note this kind of divide between the left that is negating class issues in your article on the privilege walk last year that you wrote for Non-Site. You write, the privilege walk is now a standard element in the diversity training used by nonprofits, churches, universities, corporations, and even some parts of the US military. Proponents of the walk say it helps us unlearn oppression and build alliances across difference. Mainstream critics say that the exercise propagates divisive identity politics and mock it as foundational to the oppression Olympics. A Marxist critique would say that the walk transmogrifies material problems into cultural ones. Economic exploitation becomes the more nebulous problem of oppression. Both are forms of domination, yet they are each very distinct. I read this article when you wrote it, and I really identified with much of what you said in it, because we have among the left, in the politics that the left is propounding today, this hyper-atomization of the individual, which is anathema to what the left historically has represented. How did we get here?
That is a good question. And we should start by pointing out that, personal autonomy, liberty, was not some add-on for the left. This has historically been at the center of the agenda. The whole point of the socialist, communist, anarchist traditions were to make the promises that from those radical positions were seen as false promises, the promises of liberalism, make them real, right? The promises of the Enlightenment, the liberation of the individual from superstition, from religion, from community, right? That the critique was that, liberalism doesn't go far enough because it ignores the economic aspects of this, that you can confer legal rights, but if people are materially exploited, then those legal rights don't have any material reality. And so the point of overcoming class exploitation and creating a more egalitarian society is so that human freedom can flourish, so that the promise of the Enlightenment can be fulfilled, right? In other words, liberty has been central to a left agenda for 150 or 200 years, right? And it's only been since, I think, the 70s that that's been beginning to erode, and really accelerating in the last, 10, 15 years with this new censorious kind of vigilantism that I think is really facilitated by social media. That is one of the key areas in which liberty and freedom have become, dirty words for the left, because, getting back to that politics of the defeated camp, the victories that the left pursues now are against itself, against each other. So, that's how it's happened. And there's also, I think, specifically within the COVID moment, there's a kind of scientism and a middle class and upper middle class concern with respectability that gets wrapped up with scientism, that is to say, the cult of science, as opposed to the reality of science. The reality of science, the history of science, is a history of one paradigm after another falling, and heretics turning out to have been correct, right? So with the COVID thing, because of the Trump derangement syndrome, the politics of respectability and scientism and the shallow thinking promulgated by social media push people towards these conclusions and these anti-freedom politics for very short-term and superficial reasons, because they want to, win the internet that day. They want to have like a sick burn and a hot take and all this sort of stuff. And without thinking about it, they have turned their back on the traditional agenda, and are spinning for the little dopamine hits of likes and retweets. I think that's a lot of what it is. And also then just not they're not thinking deeply. They're not reading the full articles. They're not being with contradictions, because the whole style of thought that is demanded by social media is that you come to a conclusions, right? And you know, I frequently read things and don't take a position on them. I just read something and absorb it and kind of let it be there. And I don't think in terms of like, do I support or do I condemn this? It's like, there's pieces to the argument maybe that I find interesting, maybe pieces I don't, or regardless of the argument, maybe there's some information. So, I mean, I don't do that all the time. I also take positions. I also find arguments reprehensible and reject them. I find other arguments like, totally compelling and immediately embrace them. But I think it's important to realize that that's not how one should think, like a computer, right? Like 1 or 0, 1 or 0, 1 or 0. That it's like you can also just let information, history, ideas be in your mind and not pass judgment on them immediately. So, but social media does not allow for that. So I think that's part of how the left has lost it. But I think it's also, it was about the internal policing that comes out of like movement culture. There's a kind of, the ultra left politics of the new left. There's a little bit of a kind of fantasy element of, revolutionary reenactment. And so there was a lot of internal policing begins, often well-meaning and to some extent necessary, like, feminists in Students for Democratic Society, calling out, the sexism of their peers. I mean, their male peers, right? I mean, it's not like there was no problems to be dealt with, but like a culture of sort of self-policing sets in, and a discourse around like our people, our communities, taking care of ourselves. It turns into this kind of, repressive set of practices that have really taken off under the current social media regime.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. You note in the first privilege walk the way in which there's been an intense focus on individuality and on what we call subjectivity. And you write, in the name of politics and done at the expense of political economy. What has led us to not be able to tease out one from the other? In a sense, we've conflated them such that I had someone on my Facebook wall last year, and it was March, when I said, I think we need to rethink what's happening here. But you were pro-lockdown the other week. And I said, yes. And I take information in, I read a lot, and then I come to different conclusions because we're not frozen in time. And this virus is not all understood. At least it wasn't a month ago. Now we understand much more of it. Is it the case that we must remain locked down as if it's a middle-aged plague, and we must now give in to the powers that be because they say so? At what point can we say it's time to leave our house?
Yeah, I mean, as Keynes said, when I'm confronted by new information, I change my mind. What do you do?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I was the same way. I mean, in early March, I was washing my groceries, scolding my mother for not doing the same, but it was because I took it so seriously that I was also reading closely, and I wanted to know, well, what is the real fatality rate of this disease? And then it started coming out. There was a study in Iceland, and I get into all this in the gray zone piece, right? It's like the infection fatality rate rather than the case fatality rate. And to determine the infection fatality rate, you've got to sample whole populations. They did that in Iceland, and they found out that, whoa, first of all, there's a lot of asymptomatic cases, and therefore the infection fatality rate is much, much lower than we thought. It was like essentially similar to a very bad version of seasonal influenza, like a very, very bad, not Spanish flu, but like, current, more modern versions of influenza. It's sort of like 2 or 3 times as bad as a typical bad flu season. I mean, so that's serious, right? And that does require some interventions. And that's where the Great Barrington Declaration comes along, which everyone condemned for guilt by association, which is another thing I've noticed in this time. My friends, some of the more intelligent people I know, even just do this thing where it's like, well, that was published in the New York Post. Like, Hunter Biden's laptop. It's like, well, you can't believe that because that was in the New York Post. It's like, look, man, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Can we just like think about these things? But anyway, so you see that the research from Iceland started coming in, from the Princess cruise that was trapped in Tokyo Harbor, and then I realized, oh, wait a minute, this isn't as bad as we thought. The field hospitals in New York City are closed, and then it was at that point where I realized, okay, there's no room for thinking because this has been totally politicized. And then some of the things that were not discussed along the way was the tremendous damage being done in the global south. I mean, these really vicious lockdowns, 80,000 people arrested in the Dominican Republic, 40,000 people arrested in Guatemala. And your readers know this, your listeners know this, but it's worth reminding them, Guatemalan jails are not nice places. No jail is nice, but particularly in a very, very poor state like Guatemala, right? On and on, it's kind of repression. The teachers union in Jordan being totally smashed and dissolved by the state in the name of fighting COVID. The fact that basically 10 years of improving macroeconomic conditions in the global south are put into reverse, and the debt in the global south soars, poverty in the global south soars, deaths from starvation among children shoot up, right? This is all basically ignored, right? And it's being caused by the fact that these states are following the lockdowns, and also by the economic whiplash of the huge hit that northern economies took in 2020. Right, there's this like massive dive in economic growth. I think it's like 20% decline in the second quarter of 2020. But then, of course, there's this enormous amounts of money printed and pushed into the system that gin up asset values. There's been a massive inflation of financial asset values, and that's helped the 1%. But there was also some redistribution that had to happen, through the CARES Act, and that's the stimulus checks and the unemployment. But that initial kind of dive in the northern economies translates into economic whiplash in the global south, and massive increases in poverty and debt, collapse of remittances, et cetera, et cetera. Hardly any of that is discussed. I mean, to be fair, there were some articles about this here and there in the left press, but very marginal. So it's terrible. It's a disaster what has happened here, and a lot of people have turned against the left, and the left is unaware of this, it seems to me, because the left has become so proficient at insulating itself and policing itself and condemning others who don't agree with them. But there's going to be a lot of right-wing political victories in the near future. There's also going to be, this also has a lot to do with the Ukrainian war, right? There's already a new food crisis, and we saw what that did in 2011, that led directly to the Arab Spring, and the collapse of various countries into failed states. So we're entering a total restructuring of the international political economy, right? A breaking into camps, a renewed cycle of crisis, instability, and debt and suffering in the global south. And in the core economies, like the liberal center has shown itself to be profoundly authoritarian. The policymakers, the bureaucrats, and the rank and file, the the chattering classes that, from which the left, the professional left, at least in the US, mostly draws its self-identifying members, have revealed their taste for fundamentally repressive policies of censorship and segregation and punishment, punitive bullying. And all of this divides the working class, it interesting. There was the first Amazon warehouse just organized a union, an independent union, here in the US, in New York City. And the guy who led the organizing, named Christian Smalls, his first beef with Amazon was around lack of personal protective equipment. But Amazon fired him for violating social distancing rules, right? That's an illustration of how these measures are not apolitical. They are not, purely technical. They're always available for hierarchies to use against members of people lower down the hierarchy, right? So and the left has embraced all this stuff as if it's purely technical, totally apolitical. And if you have a beef with these vaccines and these vaccine mandates, you are ipso facto totally out of your mind, right? But I mean, that's totally wrong and superficial. Very few things are apolitical and purely technical, and certainly not these measures, which have divided the working class. And this is happening at the time where we now have the tightest labor market in 40 years. And the left should be working to unite the working class and unite everyone to push for better working conditions and higher wages. And while some of that is beginning to happen, per the Amazon victory, far more energy has gone into bullying and dividing. My union has sent out way more emails about COVID than it did about the Build Back Better agenda, which was Biden's designed to fail social spending package.
I kept wondering throughout all this, and I was in touch with George Agamben as well.
Wow, that's
He's going
cool.
to come on the show at some point,
Oh, that's
actually.
excellent.
I'm writing up all the questions and organizing that now. But I had to wonder, why did we not have philosophers on camera nightly or weekly talking about some of the ethical dimensions of lockdown? Because one thing that struck me, given that in Italy the average age of COVID death was 83 at one point, I believe the number is right around there still, which is
And that must be higher than the average life expectancy in Italy, I would
exactly,
imagine.
exactly. Why didn't we have philosophers discussing this? Because what I feel is that I was put into a pressure cooker, many people were, where we had to homeschool, magically find time to work, magically find time to eat. If you're homeschooling children, you don't have time to work and eat as a parent. And we weren't asked to discuss what we were putting in the balance here. We were asked to give up our savings, our livelihoods, our health, our sleep, in return for people to live another week or two or month or two or year or two. And I know this sounds callous to some people, but this is the reality of what happens when you are in triage, even in a A&E. You have to decide who gets treatment first and why. And people are put on this waiting list of according to age and the seriousness of their injury or sickness, etc. But we never did a triage, not really, around what was asked of all of us who were losing our livelihoods, who were suffering economically and psychologically.
Yeah, and we now know also dying. I mean, it wasn't, it wasn't even as harsh as you're saying. It wasn't just like the triage question. It was a basic cost benefit analysis, which we do all the time and which is central to medicine, right? I mean, honest medicine realizes that there's always a risk with a medical intervention, and it's like cost benefit analysis. Is it worth doing this? But so yeah, we were not allowed to do a cost benefit analysis. Had we, it would have come out much sooner that, well, wait a minute, these lockdowns kill people. In your effort to save the most vulnerable among us, you could be killing other people. And in this country, we had a 30% increase in murders during the first year of the lockdown that's directly linked to the lockdowns. One thing that criminologists have known for years, left, right, and center, criminologists understand that work is the most effective form of anti-crime social control. And it's actually not necessarily because of the income that comes with work. The more important factor is that it absorbs your time. And when people have all day to stew and fester with their rivals, etc., murder occurs, you know. But when those dynamics of hostility get interrupted by like time to get up and go to work again, you know, and now you've got some new problem at work that absorbs your psychic energy, right? So, you know, murders went up. I mean, even traffic deaths went up, even as number of miles driven went down. Interestingly, suicide stayed level. The foregoing all elective care has translated into increase in um, more severe cancers and cardiovascular disease. It's crazy. You know, I mean, one thing that I think is important for my article is that the incentive for overcounting these deaths, because that was crucial to the hype and fear that the left clung to, right? And so I don't charge some massive conspiracy. I show how in the chaotic moments, early moments of this pandemic, the government's policies, on the one hand, created a crisis for the healthcare system, and then on the other hand, through the CARES Act, created an incentive to overcount COVID deaths. And the incentive was the Providers Relief Fund, which was $178 billion, which is equal to a quarter of the US military budget. This was a fund that would allow, that would cover the costs of COVID care at 120% of typical Medicare coverage. So you have the government, on the one hand, shutting down in basically every state except for North Dakota, shutting down elective procedures, which sends hospitals and the healthcare industry into a financial crisis. By the end of April, 1.4 million healthcare workers in the middle of a pandemic had been fired because of financial crisis, right? And so then there's this incentive, like, here's this money that you can have, and it'll come quickly, and we'll give you a 20% bonus if you can show that these cases are COVID. At first, to qualify for this Provider Relief Fund money, healthcare providers had to have an in vitro test. Those rules were changed so that basically, if a doctor thought that it was COVID, you know, you could get this money. I mean, even COVID funerals were being subsidized. So it's not to charge like some grand conspiracy, but it's like this incentive structure was created in this moment of chaos. And so that helps explain why COVID deaths in the US, along with how unhealthy we are, that helps explain why we had 63% more COVID deaths, or deaths classified as COVID, than our next closest, or the average OECD country, you know. And if you look at the numbers, it's sort of like the US, Belgium, and the UK, and then way down are the other wealthy economies, much lower rates of COVID death. And already in the US, these deaths are being scaled back. The CDC knocked down its numbers by 70,000 recently. The state of Massachusetts just 2 weeks ago reduced its tally of COVID deaths by over 4,000. So we know that that there's a lot of room in what qualifies as a COVID death.
Well, one thing that struck me as well during the summer of 2020, when we saw the statistics coming out, well, they were coming out immediately, but it was very firmly known at that point that the comorbidities were obesity, diabetes, and cardiac issues, heart, blood pressure issues related to COVID deaths. Why did, in my knowledge, no government has taken any kind of action to work to ask populations to be more invested in personal health, for instance? Why were governments not giving the poor, let's say, passes to the gym or something that would actually work to produce a healthier population that might be less at risk of getting seriously ill from this illness? I saw very little action, proactive action, I should say, happening to mitigate the problems surrounding COVID that could be directly reduced by exercise and diet?
Yeah. I mean, the simple answer is because the pharmaceutical industry was making too much money. And if you invest in it, you also saw your, stock portfolio increasing, and that all of the, quantitative easing justified by the the hysteria was also ginning up asset prices. So that would be the very crass, simple explanation, right? That elites were making too much money off of this to take any other path. And the public health, like in this country, the public health officials are they're literally invested in this. Half of, not half, but like between 40 and 45% of the budgets of the CDC and the NIH come directly from user fees that are generated by doing research for big pharma. The government scientists are allowed to own patents and make money. They're allowed to make up to $150,000 a year per patent. To be fair, most of the patents don't make that much. The average patent makes just shy of $10,000 a year. But so there's also, that material incentive is that the actual bureaucracy is staffed by people whose material interests would be threatened by the kind of health advice you just suggested, right? What they want is for everybody to go out and get as many shots, which in this country have all been on the public dime, as many shots as possible, right?
Yes, but it's interesting that the companies like Moderna and Pfizer have not been held to account for their scientific information, have they
Oh
now?
yeah, no, they haven't,
And
right?
and you noted in your article that Chomsky hand waved the issue away. I had him on the show. He was my first guest on this podcast. And I asked him about this, and I was a bit alarmed by his response because I think that there should be more distrust of the information that we're given. Just as an intellectual, we should be distrustful, right? On that count. But as information came in over the course of 2020, we were not given enough information to carpet any kind of rationale for lockdowns. It was already known then. Hence, the Great Barrington Declaration received so many signatures early on. And it's now it's over 80,000, I believe, of scientists and doctors who've signed it. So I would like to know why people like Noam Chomsky, who's always been distrustful of private corporations, why they're not aware that the public domain, our government, is getting the information from these private corporations, and these private corporations are blocking access in court to releasing this information.
That's a good question. I mean, I guess it's just fear, right? They're being overwhelmed by fear, that 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 you know that even Noam Chomsky, who has done so much to criticize the manufacturing of consent, is susceptible to the same processes, and he has seems to just be terrorized by this, and has put his faith in these vaccines. um I think that's part of it, but and it's a response to the whole social environment too, that it's like it's very, very hard to break from the herd. I mean, you're going to lose friends. I've lost friends over this. I mean, if you dissent, you will be shunned, right? And there's also a class thing. I think that you know the middle classes, the professional classes, who expect to be listened to, are very concerned with their social standing among their peers. And working class people, it seems to me, are much less concerned with that, because that's not as big a part of their work lives and therefore their social lives, right? I mean, you can be a fantastic carpenter, and have crazy ideas, right? You can be an amazing mechanic and believe in all sorts of crackpot stuff, and no one's going to be like, whoa, don't get your car fixed by that guy. He's totally insane. He believes in the Loch Ness monster. You'd be like, doesn't matter. Guy's great with he's great with these difficult old cars or whatever, right? And so there's a kind of intellectual freedom in the working class that doesn't exist for the professional classes. And the professional classes, it's like uh, the politics of respectability are very intense. So I think that's part of it too, is that like people unconsciously don't want to break from the herd because they know they will be condemned and uninvited and possibly, worst of all, laughed at, so it's a kind of like moral cowardice based in a particular kind of petty bourgeois vanity. It's pretty pathetic.
You mentioned earlier the Hunter Biden laptop. I investigated this story early on as well, and I was rather alarmed that the New York Times and other major outlets were running stories casting doubt, aspersions on the validity of this laptop, which had already been authenticated.
Yeah. Well, then they censored it. I mean, the discussion of it was censored.
Yeah, I know it's censored between major media running hit pieces on the New York Post and then social media blocking the New York Post's account and sharing of anything related to that article, locking out people from their accounts who did share the article. It was a full-on coup d'etat of the social media sector. And I've noticed in my work on other issues that there is a almost brotherhood between government, major media, and social media. When I say government, I'm talking in these days the Democratic Party. We saw this with Russiagate as well. We had to pull teeth out to get the New York Times to admit that it got some things wrong about Russiagate.
Yep.
And all these outlets ran with lies, were allowed to run with lies. And then last week, was it, or just the week before, we get the New York Times admitting finally that the Hunter Biden laptop was real. Well,
Yep.
it was already known to be real. And so we're running in this crowd of folks who will not want to follow me on Twitter because I dare share something from the New York Post. How did we get to this era where just sharing something from Fox News or the New York Post will make you persona non grata in the eyes of the woke left?
Yeah. Well, social media and politics of respectability. I think that's, and identity politics and the kind of politics of the defeated camp and the kind of fantasy football like left politics where you do the end of the revolution first, take down the statue. I mean, they have it completely out of order. No. First you take state power, then you pull down the old regime statues. Not that I'm like I'm in favor of taking down statues of traitors like Robert E. Lee, but let's just be clear that it doesn't really do that much. But the yeah, it's this whole thing of censorship by private corporations is really important. As I mentioned this in the article too, I mean, I've been shocked by the number of people who say to me like, well, that's an interesting case. Oh, the censorship of Joe Rogan, Spotify taking down 20,000 individual podcast episodes of various people because of COVID content. That's not really censorship. It's like, okay, well, whatever you want to call it, it's wrong. And it is, the 1% dominating our mental landscape. So you can call it information smoothing. You can call it, information curation for social harmony. You call it whatever kind of ridiculous name you want. It's wrong, and it's capital dominating the intellectual life of the population. It's important to remember, right, that In-Q-Tel is, the CIA's venture capital firm, was a crucial early investor in a lot of these companies. That doesn't mean all of this is controlled by the CIA, but it means that there's an influence from the government. And, something interesting happens in the 70s, which is that the CIA is busted spying domestically, which is illegal. There are 3 different commissions about this. The Rockefeller Commission, there's 2 early kind of failed commissions in the early 70s, and then finally the Church Committee in the Senate exposes this. And there's a massive destruction of documents associated with Operation Chaos, which was an illegal, domestically oriented version of COINTELPRO, a kind of like counterinsurgency domestically run by the CIA, managed by James Jesus Angleton. And after that, the kind of being taken to the woodshed by the Church Committee hearing, the CIA is very clear about like, we have to do more of this off the books. And that's when the whole off the books approach begins. We saw that during Iran-Contra, right? It wasn't just some sort of mask. It was like, The CIA was legitimately moving things into the private sector. It's the whole politics of the nudge. And they realize it's like the agency doesn't have to be in control of everything. And it's like you can trust private corporations and your allies in the foundations, to carry on the same agenda, right? Uh, and you can social control can happen more organically, more collaboratively, right? So that begins as a kind of pattern of social control, a method of social control, to be less state focused and to push it out and let go of it and allow the foundations, allow private corporations to carry on the preferred agenda, to have a little faith in your allies in the corporate sector. And that's part of what's going on here with social media. It's not to say social media is actually controlled by the CIA. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that, like, this idea that the state's agenda is not somehow actualized by these private sector corporations is naive and ahistorical, and it doesn't realize it's to not be aware of the way in which the state realized that it doesn't have to keep everything on its books, that it can pursue its goals through the private sector. And you see this in more benign ways, just like Al Gore's reinvention of government, right? The tremendous rise of military contracting. I used to be a conflict reporter and spent a lot of time in war zones. And it's like the amount of private sector activity associated with the US military is vastly increased since Vietnam, right? During the Vietnam War, most logistics were done by the military. The Seabees built things. Now it's all done by these private firms, right? So throughout government, there has been a subcontracting, a massive sort of like transition to subcontracting. And there's an element of that with social media. And I think people on the left should be a little more nuanced and not be like, well, it's the private sector. It has nothing to do with the state's agenda. That's not true at all.
Well, there's a lot of people who believe what they read in the papers because, as you know, most people don't have time to do research to make sure that what the New York Times is telling them is actually true. So we're stuck in this gyre
Yeah.
of information where the word disinformation is used regularly by people who just want to beef up their own narrative while dissing the other. How is the average working person supposed to know what is being said in the media as true or false? This is another problem that we have, because add social media to that, and you can be easily at a loss as to what to believe.
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I mean, one has to learn to read more critically, and there's certain tricks. It's like pretty much everything does come out, I mean, as per the example of the New York Times and the Washington Post recently admitting that the Hunter Biden laptop is real, right? It's like eventually it all comes out. And so, you got to read the bottoms of the articles. You got to read the little throwaway comments. I mean, frequently the big stories, the truth, the key to explaining things are in these papers, but as throwaway comments. For example, I mean, I have one in the article where it's about, buried in a long Financial Times article about vaccines in the global south, there was like one or two lines about how rollout of vaccines in the global south were also harmed by the fact that Pfizer and the other vaccine producers demanded indemnification and publicly funded um, public funds to protect them should they face lawsuits. And some countries in the global south, for example, South Africa, said, no, we're not going to change our laws to protect you against any liability. And we're not going to take public money and put it in a fund to help you face down any legal challenges, right? So, I mean, that's a huge story. That should have been a constant theme, headlines, but it's in there, it's buried. So it's like, I mean, I don't know. The answer to your question is how's the average working class person supposed to wade through the ideological spin to get to the facts that are usually present here and there, scattered throughout the coverage. I mean, it takes a lot of time, and it takes a kind of a weird combination of cynicism and critical thinking, but also realizing that many of these publications do also tell you the truth. It's buried, it's in the bottom, it's packaged as if it's not important, but you got to learn to trust your own instincts. If you read a fact and you think, wow, that strikes me as something that's very important, even though the framing of this article suggests that it's an unimportant detail, trust yourself,
Right. As I suggested earlier, philosophers on screen every week. But is there a moment even now for us to have a social debate over death? Because a lot of this was driven by pure fear of death. People went
Yeah.
hysterical, for lack of a better word, over the fact that their grandparent might die. Now,
Yeah.
grandparents die, and guess what? You and I are going to die. This is just part of
Mhm.
life. And I was a bit apoplectic at certain moments when I was reading media stories and the hype over this, why we weren't discussing death, like in a very basic, humane way.
Yeah, we should have that conversation. What I noted about that was why this threat? Why these deaths? I mean, why are we not concerned about automobiles? Why are we not freaking out about the danger of driving? Why are we not freaking out about the danger of air pollution? The fact that you know thousands and thousands of people are killed every year breathing filthy air. Yeah, yeah, it's like, and I think you know the the fact that we don't discuss all these risks, that you know increasingly deregulated neoliberal capitalism does introduce more and more risk into everyday life, that people carry that fear, and then they try and deal with this either by obsessing about it and becoming hypochondriacs or just going into denial about it, but that it's there anyway. And then there's no public discussion about any of this stuff, like how afraid of whatever routine risk it is should we be. We don't have those conversations. So then finally we had this one public conversation about risk and danger and health, and all of the anxiety about all the other risks seemed to cathect upon this. And so instead of talking about the carcinogenic chemicals in our food and the insane uh, you know danger of our transportation system, we focused on COVID. And yeah, I mean, we should have that conversation about death, but we shouldn't be cavalier about it, because and I don't think that's necessary. And that's what the Great Barrington Declaration, which should be pointed out, didn't have many details, right? It was a set of principles, which is like focused protection, right? Um, we don't have to accept, like, well, we're just going to sacrifice the old. No, we can say, wait a minute, we need to come up with a system to protect the most vulnerable. We're talking about, the elderly. That's who this mostly kills. It's like, was it like 2/3 of all deaths occurred in people over the age of 70, um, and people with comorbidity. So it's like, how could we protect the most vulnerable rather than just invoking the most vulnerable among us while we trash society and you know um, basically have this pharmaceutical coup d'etat unnamed and force everybody, force through the pharmaceutical industry's wet dream agenda, the tech sector's wet dream agenda, and the financial sector's wet dream agenda of of basically having endless free money from the government, basically having the public through the Federal Reserve be the customer to which you get to sell garbage corporate bonds. That's what's going on. There are all these zombie firms. Like the credit rating of most American firms has collapsed compared to what it was 20 or 30 years ago. When I looked into it recently, only Johnson and Johnson still had a AAA credit rating, right? And there are a lot of companies such as J.C. Penney's that like would not be in business if it weren't for quantitative easing. That is to say, they would not be in business if the Federal Reserve were not buying their corporate bonds, because the private sector would look at the risk and say, well, there's no way that J.C. Penney is able to pay these bonds back. If you lend them money, they're going to go under, unless, of course, they can continually sell new bonds, right? And so quantitative easing involves the Federal Reserve going into these markets and buying these garbage, these junk bonds, um, so all this, so corporate America, like, was, making money hand over fist during this crisis is the point.
It mirrors a lot of the Wall Street bailout as well, where corporations matter more than all the other diseases that could be talked about, all the ways in which children dying. Well, we can talk about the 3,000 children's deaths in the US, but if we really want to address travesty on a massive scale, we should be talking about poverty and malnutrition and thirst, something that a lot of corporations have a hand in. I don't know if
Yeah.
you caught the nation's coverage of the water wars. This was around 2003, 4. But it's quite fascinating to see how Pepsi Cola, Coca-Cola, Perrier have gone to countries like South Africa, where water is written into their constitution so that everyone has an access to, a right to it. And they try to get them to change their constitution because money. And it's really daunting when you start to look at the vaster panorama of why, you asked earlier, why COVID? Why not all these other diseases that kill far more people? And those questions haven't been asked, and they're conveniently not being asked. So my last question for you is this. A lot of people on social media these weeks are saying, oh, we're being fed a new stage of trauma, which is now Russia, Ukraine. We go from COVID to Russia, Ukraine. And I'm thinking, to the way in which people like Matt Taibbi have said quite astutely that the media is ramping out anger. People can be angry with other people, can be angry with the opposite political party. And are we caught in this cycle where media is sort of controlling the way we live our lives intellectually and emotionally, so that now we've gone from being immunologists to being somehow experts on Ukraine, Russia?
Yes. I mean, we are, if we follow what we're told. And unfortunately, it seems that, the middle classes, who are the more avid media consumers, also seem to be the most ideologically in step with the system. But yes, it's almost comical. It would be comical if it weren't so tragic, the way this, the panicked, hysterical mob that mainstream society in the West has been so quickly and easily turned into you know uh, towards baying for blood, right? We've got Sean Penn last night saying, or maybe it was the night before, on Hannity, saying that the U.S. needs to not be so afraid of threatening use of its atomic arsenal. I mean, that's just totally insane. All these people talking about, we need to have a no-fly zone, which is a total misnomer. It's not a no-fly zone. It means we need to have an air war with Russia. This is crazy, right? And it is deeply depressing. I mean, it's hard to maintain political faith under these conditions. One just has to be sort of zen, and keep doing the right thing in a kind of, with a feeling of sort of non-attachment. It's like, don't get fixated on whether or not you succeed, but just keep doing the right thing. Think critically, read, spend your time wisely, shut out the mindless chatter and the hostility of the online mobs, and stay focused, and I guess just have faith that in the long run, people will realize their class interests, and we will overcome this spectacle of moralizing and divisive nonsense, and get down to the real politics of fighting against the economic elites who control everything and are running our planet into the ditch.